Appreciate everyone that is here for class this morning. We're continuing our introduction of sorts to the Gospel Project, a reintroduction. And a couple of things going on today for that. One, I just wanted to promote an idea that I'm thinking for Wednesday nights, not this Wednesday night, so just to catch you up. We canceled a couple of Wednesday nights because we had a local outbreak and a member with COVID and a staff member with COVID and an elder with COVID and some kids with COVID. And so we said, okay, we won't do Wednesday night for a couple of weeks. This coming Wednesday night, we're going to do a work night. We had planned to launch a larger working Wednesday service program. We're going to postpone the larger program because I want to launch it when we have people here to do it and do it right. But we are going to have a one-off work night this Wednesday night to get some projects done we were putting off until we could start that larger program, and well, they need doing. So we're going to go ahead and do that this Wednesday night. The following Wednesday, we're going to launch an adult class and just do that for a while until, again, we can launch that larger program and do it right. The class that I'm contemplating doing for adults is a How We Got the Bible class. We'd start with Moses, I guess, and come forward to the Bible that's in your hand and say, how do we get here? So you cover, it's 3,500 years of history. You got to tell a lot of stories, but talk about how we get the manuscripts. Are they reliable? One of the last lessons is what's the difference, why there's so many translations and what's the difference? What about books that aren't in the Bible that some people will bring up and say, what about those? We'll talk about those in a lesson at some point. So if you have a curiosity about that, you have questions you wanted to ask, that will be a class that might interest you. How we got the Bible. I think it's a fun story that is encouraging to tell, even though parts of it are challenging. So we'll do that. And you might think of that also as another preparatory set of classes for the Gospel Project. How do we get this Bible? Okay. Today, we're going to talk about this question: is there a story here? And by here, I mean in the Bible. How many of you have, I won't even ask if you were successful or not, but how many of you have attempted a read through the Bible in a year type plan? Okay. Did you find it difficult to understand the overall flow of the book? Yeah. One of the challenging things of the Bible is it's not a novel, not even a documentary. It's not written that way, where one chapter follows the next all the way through. It is a compilation of books, which themselves are compilation of stories from different eras, and sometimes not even stories. Sometimes legal documents, sometimes theological, philosophy documents. There's quite a lot of different material. And so one question we have is there even a coherent story in this book from start to finish? The Gospel Project program that we teach to the kids and adults and all the way through our church every 3 years is committed to the belief that there is one story. Okay, that there is one primary story that runs through the whole text. So I thought today I would try to convince you of that. We won't look at any particular verse of the Bible. In fact, today's lesson, you might say, comes from the table of contents. What we're going to look at is if we just kind of at a bird's eye view worked our way through the Bible, what would be the story that we're being told that connects all the dots, or at least as many of them as possible? So pop quiz, if you had to guess, what's the story that connects the dots, and how does that story go? What might that story be? God's genealogy. Okay, a story about God, yeah. And family and his family. Okay. Salvation. Okay. That is a fantastic summary. Everybody hear that? In the beginning, God made it. It was perfect. We messed it up. God's going to fix it. Is actually my summary. That's kind of where I go with it. Is the overall picture is God makes it, we break it, and then God remakes it or fixes it or rescues it or whatever words you want to use. Creation, brokenness, and restoration. And that's repeated. That's the big story. And it's repeated in all the little stories. But all the little stories are God saying, now do this, we don't. And then there's consequences, and God gets us through the other end with something else. And so this story of creation, brokenness, restoration or redemption, or Karen used the word salvation, rescue, there's this rescue operation underway. That's the overall arc of the Bible story. If you want to think of it kind of as visually, everything's good, everything's bad, everything's better. It's kind of the story, which is interesting for me as a scientist. The natural history told in a textbook of the universe is everything starts in chaos. We get to this point where everything's pretty good and we like it. It'll eventually go back to chaos, right? The story that the atheist tells us, or the skeptic, is literally the exact opposite of the Bible story. Everything was bad. Things are pretty good now. It eventually gets bad again. The Bible says everything was good. Everything's bad now. Everything's getting better. And those are very different moral stories. And there's a reason that we insist on, the Bible has this very unique story about where we're headed and how we're going to get there. So what I'm going to do for the next 30 minutes is, hold on, we're going to cover the entire Bible, okay, quickly, and just try to summarize where do we see this story, okay? Unit 1, or Volume 1, as it's called in the Gospel Project, is titled this year, From Creation to Chaos, which gives you the idea of that first part of the story, right? God makes it, then it descends into chaos. This is a novel idea in the ancient world because we take it for granted. God made the universe, and what does he say after he makes something? It's good. That's really a novel idea to an ancient person for whom reality was really bleak. Survival was hard. And the universe seemed like a pretty rotten place. And so they imagined the gods as being pretty rotten gods. And it was Israel that said, no, actually, God is good. And in fact, the world is good. Well, if it's good, why doesn't it feel good? We messed it up. This isn't a punishment from the gods. This is our failure that created this problem. So Genesis has this kind of simple trend. God created a good universe. That's the first act, chapters 1 and 2. We break it in chapter 3, and then every chapter after that, we break it some more, okay? In fact, we break it till it breaks. Chapter 3, we sin a little, and then chapter 4, we sin some more. Chapter 5, we sin some more. Chapter 6, God says, all right, it's flood time, right? And puts it back to a different state. And then we do okay from then on, right? No, then we just do it all over again. So we broke it, and then God has this plan to fix it that's going to work itself out through the rest of the text. But it's not an all-at-once kind of plan. So the things we'll cover this fall, starting in September, is in the beginning, the idea of a good creation, that we should have a positive view of creation. Creation being ruined is the second unit, where we talk about our role in breaking it then and how we're still participating in that. When we sin, we're still participating in the problem rather than the solution. And then the idea of God has a rescue plan, and the rest of the book is telling that plan. The rest of Scripture is how God works out that plan. Probably the surprise is, if this were a novel, you would just go to the next section and introduce our hero, right? Then comes Jesus. And that's not the way the Bible is told. It's a very lengthy plan that's going to work its way out through various peoples, okay? So, Volume 2 talks about from captivity to the wilderness. So if you read through Genesis, you get this man, Abraham, and his family, and they end up in Egypt, Okay? God made promises to Abraham. That was a good thing. People end up in Egypt. That's not such a good thing. And so God's going to bring them back out again. So God's plan would come through one people. You might think of this as kind of a funnel. So the creation is the top of the funnel. That's where the problem is. And then we're going to shrink it down. We're going to deal with just one people, Israel. Okay? And they're going to have their own version of this story, which is Israel's good, Israel's bad, Israel's rescued. And that's going to play out on the people level. Those people, at the time we find them in Exodus, are enslaved. And so what does God do? Well, this is how the story goes. Good, bad, better. We're at the better part. God's going to bring them out of Egypt and further the plan for rescuing us. So in the winter months, we're going to cover out of Egypt and the story of Moses and the Exodus, into the wilderness and away from the land, which is the story of Israel in the wilderness, and the fits and starts that are involved in working out that plan of rescue out of Egypt. That'll be Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all that through the winter months. Volume 3 is from conquest to kingdom. Okay? If these people are going to be a people, eventually they have to get to where they're going. So the book of Joshua tells the story of the conquest, the story of God's people receiving God's promises, that they had been told this would happen, and it does at some level. And then eventually turning from a wandering mass of tribes into a kingdom, a nation, an organized group, through the book of 1 Samuel. The story points are God does indeed keep his promise. That's one of the base. If you can't believe God keeps his promise back in Joshua, well, you're going to have a hard time waiting until Matthew, right? So it has to establish early on, God does keep his promise. This plan is a long plan, but it's worth waiting on. The chosen people then become a chosen nation. It gets structure and shape and form, which gives you a picture of what God has in mind, of bringing order out of the chaos, of building something good. But what do we do with that nation? God gives us a nation and then we run it just right? No, we break the nation. You know the expression, this is why we can't have nice things? That's the whole Bible, right? Here, Israel, here's a nation. That's why we can't have nice things. Because then we immediately go about trying to break it and ruin it. And so when you get to the end of Judges, for example, Israel is as big a mess as you could ever find. And so, okay, we'll fix that by structuring the kingdom better. We'll give them a king. But spring will cover that section of back to the land, into the land, and a pattern of disobedience. That's going to repeat throughout the entire Bible. It's a cycle instead of a loop, as we were saying, of creation, brokenness, restoration. We'll just do that in a circle over and over again. And that's the pattern set forward in Judges. That's going to follow them all the way through. It's not just a Judges pattern. It's a 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings pattern that we're just going to keep doing over and over on a big scale of breaking the nation. So we get a nation. We start out with unity. It ends in division. This is the story of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st Kings. God, as it turns out, wants to work through leaders. Are these leaders great people? Yes. Yeah, it's not an easy one to answer. I mean, they have good qualities. They even have great qualities in some cases. They have a lot of bad qualities, okay? They are, the nicest thing we could say is they are deeply flawed leaders, okay? Deeply flawed. The microphone was trying to run away there. Let me put it back on, okay? Deeply flawed. God overcomes those flaws. And that's an important detail for us to remember moving through the story. Why doesn't the story end just immediately? Why doesn't God just say, all right, here's a kingdom, here's a perfect leader. There's something about the flaw that comes from us that is important for us to know. And it's important for us to know how God can triumph over and through the flaw that we have in our character, whether it's Saul or David or Solomon. Okay? Kind of discuss this just briefly. We don't want to believe that we have to have perfect leaders, because that's just not the case. We also don't want to believe that flaws are a good idea. And sometimes we do that. We'll say, well, God uses imperfect people, so go flaws, right? No. That's Paul in Romans chapter 6. Shall we sin all the more that grace may abound? God forbid, right? It's not a suggestion that sin's a great idea, so keep doing that because God keeps fixing it. But it's a story of, yes, you're flawed. Yes, God can overcome those flaws. So one of the beautiful things about the 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings stories are how honestly it tells the flaws of leaders. I got to tell you, ancient documents do not do this. You can go, hop on a bus and go to Iran. You can see the Cyrus cylinder in their museum. And it tells the story of Cyrus conquering Mesopotamia. And you know what the historian says about Cyrus? That historian that was paid by Cyrus and under the threat of death if he did a bad job, he has a very high opinion of Cyrus. He says Cyrus was fantastic. He never lost a battle. Nothing ever went wrong. His people adored him, right? Ancient history records tell these stories of marvelous kings because there was usually a sword at the neck of the guy writing the history. Okay. The only ancient documents that consistently tell us, oh, our kings were terrible, is the Hebrew documents. They are painfully honest, which to me credits their reliability. Like, these were not scrubbed clean. These were not censored. These are the honest, believable accounts. David is the biggest hero of the Old Testament narratives. For instance, if you read 1st, 2nd Chronicles, 1st, 2nd Chronicles starts out and says, David didn't serve any other god. Okay? And then every other king after that is compared to David. And usually, and he wasn't a good king like his forefather David, and so this happened. And that line is repeated over and over. David's the hero, David's the hero, David's the hero. But 1st and 2nd Samuel tell you the story of David committing adultery, murdering a man, covering it up, losing his own children, being chased out of his own capital during a civil war. These are not good stories. Like, if you read 1st and 2nd Samuel first, you think, was he even a good king? He doesn't even have a heroic death. The first chapter of 1 Kings, anybody know how David is portrayed? If you read the first chapter of 1 Kings, here's the first story of the book of the Kings. David is old, so old he can't keep warm at night. And they have a woman that they pay to sleep next to him just so he'll be warm and not die in his sleep. That's the first story of the book of Kings. Isn't that a heroic picture? I mean, it's like a sad, pathetic end of a man. And yet it just tells that story. Okay. So, point being, God works through leaders. Those leaders are flawed, and the Old Testament is very candid about it. God overcomes those flaws. He doesn't encourage them, but he does triumph over them. So, summer, a year from now, we'll be working through King Saul, King David, King Solomon, which are 3 great studies in leadership and lack thereof. Like, each of them is a good leader in some category, and each of them is a terrible leader in some other category. Saul is an interesting leader. I mean, if you're looking for a pragmatist, Saul is your guy. A very practical leader. It just works horribly. From exile to rebellion, 1 Kings through the prophetic literature. This is about as far as we had gotten before COVID came and interrupted us, and we didn't get any further. So you know all of this perfectly, right? We covered it 16 months ago. What's the story here? The story here is that sin has consequences. That's back to this point of we're flawed or we break things. The main point of 1st, 2nd Kings and that whole chunk of documents is that sin has horrible consequences fact, I don't want to say unavoidable consequences, but almost unavoidable consequences. That you can't make choices like that and expect things to be okay. Not only that, they have long-term consequences. The fancy word people use today is systemic consequences, that sin reproduces problems beyond the people who committed the sin. That there are problems for generations to come because of evil. Okay? God spends a lot of time warning of those consequences. If I had to summarize all the major and minor prophets, it would be, y'all better quit it. That's pretty much the message, right? Something's about to be bad. Maybe too late, but you better quit it. And that's the message over and over again, that this is eventually going to have consequences. If you were to put a positive spin on it, you could say the story is of God's overwhelming patience. That part of me says this could have been a lot shorter. Consequence happens the day after we sin, lightning bolt, done. Let's pick a new nation. How about Belgium? Right? We could just move on and have a different Bible entirely. Instead, God says, I picked you folks. You're doing it terribly wrong. I'm going to stick with you. And he keeps warning them, y'all better quit. Y'all better quit. And little episodes of consequence come up as kind of warnings of a bigger consequence. At the end of the story, though, the cycle hits rock bottom. And we talked about this cycle. And it seems like it hits the bottom and it doesn't bounce back. And that's the final story of the two destructions. The first is 729-ish BC. The Assyrians come in and they annihilate the northern kingdom. 722 BC. I was off by 7 years. 722 BC, Assyrians come in and destroy Israel, the northern kingdom. And then barely a century after that, 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians come in and destroy Jerusalem and take into exile the leadership, the educated people, folks that could have built a nation. He just rounds all them up and takes them with him. Commoners, a lot of those stayed behind. But all the leadership, people who would have been able to do something, they all go. Government in exile. And they live in Babylon. Your businessmen, your upper middle class, all ends up in Babylon. And the nation is completely broken. And it begins to look like the cycle is broken, but we're not going to bounce back from this one. Most of our Old Testament literature comes from this period. That it's not that it happened then, it's being written then. Or the history is being compiled then, right? You can't write history till it's happened. So the story of David wasn't written by David. It's written later by people who are looking back and saying, how did we get here? And they tell the story that we just read. How did we get here? And then they ask the question, think of this, every story in the Old Testament leading up to this moment is asking the question, when it looked like we were broken, was God done with us? And the answer is always, no, he wasn't done with us yet. Why would they be interested in that question? Because it seemed like God was done with them. So to answer the present question that doesn't have an answer yet, right? They're at rock bottom. They go back and they tell all the stories. Remember that time when God said we were done and then he came back and found us? Remember that time when we sinned and God came back and saved us? Remember that time? And so it's a way of contrition, of saying, this must be our fault. Seems like it always has been. But maybe God's not done with us, is a way of telling that story. So in the fall of 2022, the people disobey, warnings are issued, and then they go off into captivity and face that consequence. The section that doesn't get covered nearly as much in the Old Testament is the later prophets and Ezra and Nehemiah, which are the story of what comes after, that God does in fact respond to that tragedy. God fixes a broken nation. Hope doesn't die in Babylon, although it could have. And God's plan continues, but in a new way. Why do I say a new way? They're restored, but they're not restored back to the kingdom of David. That doesn't come back. The riches of Solomon never come back. In fact, if you read Haggai, who's one of the prophets that's after the captivity, They rebuild the temple, and people are crying because it's not as beautiful as the original temple. Well, why not? Well, the original was built by Solomon, the wealthiest man of the age. This one was built by refugees. It's going to look a little different, okay? Haggai is a grumpy old man, by the way. Haggai says, none of y'all old enough to remember it anyway, so it doesn't matter. Haggai, we get the idea that maybe Haggai had seen it as a kid before he went off into captivity. And y'all didn't see it anyway. It's fine. Okay. He's really grumpy. I like Haggai. But the plan continues, but it looks different. The temple doesn't look the same. The kingdom doesn't look the same. In fact, I don't even know if it's a kingdom anymore, because you don't have a king. You have governors and rulers and high priests, but for the rest of history, Israel's going to be run by somebody else most of the time. Okay. So in the winter of 2022, we'll talk about going into exile, coming back out of exile, and setting the work in order to rebuild, putting up a wall around Jerusalem under Nehemiah, putting up a temple, and returning to an identity that they thought had been lost. Side note, let me go back. Fun fact, how many ancient peoples were conquered by the Babylonians or the Assyrians and then got their kingdom back when it was over? I think one. I mean, it's usually when you're conquered like that, you just disappear. Somebody's going to live in your country, but it's not your people. So a good example would be the Sumerians. In the New Testament, you have Sumerians. And who are the Sumerians? Ethnically, and I'm not trying to be offensive in any way, ethnically, they're mutts. Like they're the remnant of Israel mixed with some people that moved there from over here, mixed with some Palestinians, mixed with some Babylonians, mixed with some, like they are nobodies. They live where Israel was. All the town names are the same. But these are not specifically Jewish descended people, to the point that Judah doesn't even recognize them. Okay, that's how most of the world looks after they go into Babylonian captivity or conquest. You don't get your nation back. Israel comes back and remembers who they are, which is incredible. They have a sense of identity, and they are, to my knowledge, the only people that manage that. Think about, I mean, it might be controversial, but a modern comparison. What does it mean to be Native American today? Like, actually, that's an ongoing question of trying to establish, do we still have a tribal identity? Do we still have, the European settlement came in and the world changed for them. And while Native Americans still obviously exist, they don't exist in the way they existed pre-European settlement. Does that make sense? So telling their stories and having a clear book that says, okay, here's our identity, it's just not something they have. Instead, they have tradition and oral tradition, and they try the best they can. But it's a really fuzzy picture. What does it mean to be Chickasaw, right? It's difficult to establish that. That's something that Israel succeeded in that very few in the history of the world ever have. And it's really amazing that they get through that. Okay, so the New Testament picks up a few centuries after that. There is a silent period. We should have a class on the silent period. That'd be great, right? I would just stare at you blankly for 4 centuries. And the New Testament picks up with the story that started with creation, then was a people, and then was a remnant of a people. Now the funnel comes to a point in one man who comes from heaven to earth. So God's plan narrows from one people to one man who is himself God among us. Okay, this is God come to set this story right. We're going to talk about a little bit about the birth of Jesus in spring 2023, preparing for ministry, encounters with Jesus, and early responses to Jesus. One of the fascinating things about Jesus is that everybody who meets him says this person is different. No one meets Jesus and is unfazed. Okay. And that tells us something is going on in this story. However, that's short-lived. The man God sends is greater than anything God has done before, but people reject that man in the same way they broke the nation and broke the creation. Right? So we funneled it down. The big story is now the little story. So if we had to guess, what's been the big story? God makes it, we break it, God remakes it. What shape would we expect the Jesus story to take? Yeah, the same thing. God sends us this perfect man. Obviously, we need to kill him. And then God's going to say, I can fix that too. Okay? And that's the narrative of the Gospels. So we get the miracles of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, these acts demonstrating who he is, and then we get the rejection of Jesus. It's kind of funny when you think about it. It doesn't start with rejection, and then he does miracles, and then he's accepted. It starts with acceptance, and then he teaches and does miracles, and then he's rejected. That's how pitifully stubborn we are. That when he showed us how good he actually was, we said, well, we don't want that. So then it culminates in the Gospels. All the Gospels get to the same end of the same story, which lets you know this is the fulcrum. This is the point of everything. This is where it's all been headed. And it's from death to resurrection, and it's a story of God fixing our problem again. The story of the universe is once more in one man being replayed. Creation, brokenness, and then recreation, restoration. The man comes out of the tomb. Only this is kind of an ultimate reversal. This is a reversal so big and so drastic, it reverses the entire story from now on. That up until now, it's been mostly a downhill slide with little bumps of goodness along the way. From here on out, we're moving up. From here on out, things have to get better because of the size of this reversal that Jesus has accomplished. So we get the warnings of Jesus, the arrest of Jesus, the death and resurrection of Jesus in fall 2023. From many people to one people is the story of Acts. The story is now reversed, okay? Remember, we've been coming down from creation to people to a person. Which way are we going to go now? From a person to people, okay? And we're going to start out with a small group of people. We're going to start with Israel, or even just Jerusalem. Remember, that's how the Great Commission starts. I want you to go to Jerusalem, then Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth, you see. From person back out to the world. The story's being reversed. It's a terrible sentence. It's supposed to say from one man, all the divided people of the earth receive restoration. It's reversed. You might think of Acts chapter 2 as a backwards Babel. The story of Babel, you have people who speak one language, and then they're divided with lots of languages. In Acts chapter 2, you have people with lots of different languages get to hear the gospel together. It's like everything that's been broken is getting reversed in the New Testament, starting in Acts. Jesus is alive, the church begins, and Peter's ministry in winter of 2023. From one nation to all nations, the story is further reversed. What began in one nation ends up covering the globe. You get these fun epistles. I want you to think for a minute, stop thinking of the epistles as just a piece of literature or even a letter, but think of them as a data point in this story. Philippians, Philippi. Philippi is not a Jewish town. That's a Greek name. Thessalonica, Rome, right? That our epistles don't have Jewish names. Our epistles are the world. Ephesus, Colossae. It's these Greek and Roman cities. And what they represent is the story that begins with this one man now going out into the rest of the world. Point by point, city by city, group by group. And it's a challenge because have you ever tried to tell a story to somebody who doesn't know like anything about you or your context? And then you get to the end and you say, well, you just had to be there. Okay. Why do we do that? Well, because it's hard to tell a story without kind of background information. So imagine you're Paul and you're trying to tell a bunch of Greeks, hey, here's the great big story that Ben's been telling for 20 minutes. about creation, and then we broke it, and here's our nation, and then here's Jesus, and here we go. Explain that to Greeks who share none of those views whatsoever. It's a challenge. And so each one of those little epistles represents this great task of contextualizing the story to a new group of people and helping them understand the parts of it they weren't getting in new and challenging ways. And we're still doing that. We're writing the American epistle right now. We're trying to figure out how do we communicate to these people the story of the gospel. So the church is opposed, the church grows, and the church goes are the three headings from that section. And then finally, the very end of the story is titled, From This World to the World to Come. So let's see if you can finish it. Creation, we mess it up. Kingdom and peoples, we mess it up. One man, we kill him. God resurrects the man. God spreads out a new kingdom. What would be the last thing to be fixed? The creation, right? We got to get back to where we started. We need new Genesis. Okay. So the Bible ends with the story being fully reversed. And when you get to the book of Revelation and even 2 Peter, you get language of new heaven and new earth. And this is really challenging. It's fun to me. Two parts of the Bible Christians fight over more than just about any other. Genesis and Revelation, right? We fight about how it got started, and we fight about how it's going to end. Because those are the confusing bits. The stuff in the middle where everything's messy and we're in trouble, I recognize that. That's my everyday life. It's the stuff on the ends where I say, I don't know if I get that. How did he do that, and how's he going to do this? And so we have lots of arguments in Christian circles about how does it all end? Do we all get on the mothership and go off to some other place? Does God fix this place? Do we stay here? How does that work? And the Bible describes it in more than one way, because apparently it's kind of a complicated picture. But one of the ways it's consistently described is new heaven and new earth as a way of saying whatever the first problem was is going to be fixed at the end. The problem began in Genesis 1. The problem will end with that fixed. And I think that's the important way to see it, even if we don't get to any of the details, which I'll be happy to talk about when we get to Revelation maybe. But the church on mission, Paul's mission to Rome, and the church's final hope is kind of the climax of the story. There's no book in the Bible that has more callbacks to Genesis than the book of Revelation, because it's trying to say this is that story reversed. We're going to fix it. Okay? So, to answer our question then, did I convince you? Is there a story here? I think that there is. Is it convoluted? It is. Is it told through individual episodes? It is. In fact, that's part of the challenge of reading the book is, can I find the big story in this little story? And I'll give you two fun examples. Ruth and Esther. Ruth kind of gives you a hint at the end, but if you read the story of Ruth, you think, what does a woman from Moab, a widow, have to do with the story of God redeeming mankind? So you read 4 chapters and you're like, I don't know where this is going. This is a nice love story, but where's it going? And it ends with the story of how from Ruth you end up with David. Okay, and it says, yeah, this is a piece of that bigger story. Esther is another one that's really interesting at the end of the Old Testament sequence. The name of God at no time is used in the book of Esther. So if you're trying to find God in Esther, you can't do a word search, right? It never uses his name. But when you read it, you say, this was God was working to bring about things as he often does. Now, nowhere in that story can I point to a verse and say, oh, that's the part God did. I mean this. Go home and read Esther tonight and circle the verse where you can say, God did this part all by himself. It's impossible to point to any one thing in that story and say, that's where God sent manna from heaven or turned the water into wine or raised the dead. Like, there's no obvious thing. And yet when you read the story as a whole, you say, that could not have happened if God had not been in it. And that's the challenge then of reading the whole Bible in short, is to say, can I see these stories and see God in it, even when he isn't shouting my name? Because that's going to be my life. My life's a lot more like Esther than it is like Moses. I don't get the flashy stuff in my life. It's important then to be able to read those stories and say, can I recognize the big story throughout that? Okay, out of time. Worship starts 15 minutes. Be sure to grab you a communion packet from the foyer. We'll be using those today for communion instead of the stations.